Welcome to Transformational Blueprints, the podcast that's here to tackle the big question. Why do so many transformation programs fall short, and what can we do about it? I'm Mario Michaels, founder and director of Synaxia Group, and I'm thrilled to have you join me. In this series, we go beyond theory, bringing you first-hand stories and insights from some of the world's top architecture and transformation leaders. It's all about sharing real-world lessons, sparking fresh ideas, and giving back to the architecture community. So whether you're looking to learn, be inspired, or stay ahead of the curve, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive in together. So, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking to Ben Curtis about pragmatic architecture. Ben has worked in IT for approximately 13 years and worked across the whole stack. He started on the service desk as a technician and worked up through to team leader and management, then progressed on to being field and project engineer, doing migrations and installing new systems. He was then promoted to project management, managing a team of project engineers, and then progressed to pre-sales and latterly architecture, where he's been ever since. This career progression has allowed him really to have a full picture of the different types of business area needs and what's important in the different technical teams. He's a strong interest in architecture, helping businesses leverage architecture mindset to get stuff done properly and efficiently. Outside of work, he's an avid video gamer and motorsports fan. So Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Mario. Hi, thanks for inviting me.
No problem at all. So we always start with a little bit about yourself, your background and how you got to where you are now. I know I've sort of briefly touched on that already.
Yeah, sure. So I've been passionate about technology since I was a young nipper. Very much into, I'm mesmerised by how things worked and how, a little box full of circuit boards can, go off and do sometimes really crazy things, even stuff like traffic lights. I've at an early age, I was like, how do they detect when a car pulls up? And, there's always a grey box on a street corner that ultimately controls it all, So I've always been fascinated by it, and sort of did the whole sort of route through school and college and university. So very much studied the advanced IT course we had at school, and then went into doing, computer science A-levels, and then ultimately went on to university to do, I think it was networking technologies, and then progressed straight into sort of IT straight after that. Literally onto service desks, worked for a few different sort of companies, doing sort of first line and a little bit of field engineer work, and then sort of I suppose the most of my experience was at an MSP in East Midlands called Air IT, who I joined and I was only sort of employee sort of 30 or 40, something like that. And sort of when I left them, they were, getting upwards of 150 to 200 people. So very much, sort of grew with them. And again, went from, sort of first liner on the service desk through the different ranks, became a service desk team leader at one point, and then went into sort of more field work. Going out installing PCs and, setting, network devices up for clients, and then sort of progressed into project work. So actually delivering, back then when I was doing it, 365 was very much the flavour of the day. So migrating people to 365, into that typical, server on site, but you get 365 for email kind of setup. And then sort of progressed into sort of pre-sales. We didn't really have a pre-sales function back then. So there was a lot of projects coming through where, sometimes they weren't set up right or sold correctly. So there was a gap there that ultimately I thought like I had the experience to sort out. And then that naturally progressed into architecture when we got a bit bigger, and ultimately some of the clients we were working with were bigger and they wanted a bit more kind of, structure and a bit more, sort of governance, I suppose. And then went to work for Experian for just under a year. That was a huge learning curve, because obviously they have, completely different problems and challenges, and also the scale was a big learning curve because they're a global business. So it was really interesting to sort of get into that. And then started at Node4 as a senior technical architect, concentrating on sort of 365 and modern work, and then sort of progressed into the more kind of enterprise architecture governance, and then sort of land to where I am today, which is chief architect.
Brilliant. Thanks for that overview. Just for context, what do Node4 do, just for those that don't know?
Yes, I've got to get this right because I'm sure there's a lot of people at Node4 who are counting on me for this. So Node4, I always describe them as an end-to-end IT provider. So they started off a couple of decades ago as, what I sort of call racks and wires. So very much, data center led, got their own data centers and can provide the networking and the sort of shared cloud platforms to back that up. But then, they've been quite acquisitive over the past few years and acquired companies that can develop business applications, very much look at business processes for automation and sort of Power Platform. So now we can ultimately, go to a client and say, we have the ability to host your kit, do the networking, do the security, but ultimately also develop applications and help you with your business processes that sit on top of that kit, and obviously provide a full sort of service and support wrap that sits around that. So there's I'll be honest, there's not a lot that we can't do. So yeah, it's a very interesting, very fast paced. But yeah, I love it. So can't complain.
Brilliant. Okay, good. Well, in series 2 of the podcast, we've started something whereby the previous guest asks you a question, and at the end of the episode, you'll be asking the next guest a question as well. So the question from the previous guest, who is a chap called Nadir Khan, is how do you maintain momentum and alignment when leading transformation in organizations with deeply entrenched legacy cultures and processes?
Yeah, so an interesting question, Matt. So the latter part of that, I've probably got quite a bit of exposure to. So I think it's really important to have strong communication and stakeholder engagement. I think that, and I'm probably going to go on about it quite a lot, as I'm sure your previous guests have, but it's literally the most important part of being an architect, in my opinion. And it's being able to communicate what the challenge is, what the solution is, and even if you don't have a solution, communicating, what's the transition? How do we tackle it? What's the best options? And sort of go from there. That's especially important when you have legacy cultures, because there's always going to be people or pockets of people that have been in the same way, you're doing the same things for years and years, and it's the classic old, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do, or the right thing that said people should be doing. So I think really strong engagement with them helps as well. I think clear roadmaps is probably another one. So making sure that you're being quite realistic with outcomes and ultimately when those outcomes will be delivered and how to get there. I've come across a lot of architects who will talk about, yes, we can get to point B over here, but it's like, but that's quite far away. And it's like you've got to get there, and how do you do that? And that could be 12 months away, and it's like, but what are we going to do between now and 12 months? And I think that go after the small wins and the quick wins and the incremental wins. If you can demonstrate, especially with the legacy processes, if you can demonstrate a small change which has a big impact or even a small impact, I think that is a very good thing to get people on board and get people to your way of thinking, especially if they're still buried in that legacy kind of behavior.
Find the winners.
That exactly, and get those winners in the same room as the people that you're finding challenges with. I think a couple of your previous guests have mentioned, it's very interesting when you get everybody in the same room and you get them talking about it. Areas that impact other people and may not necessarily aware of it. I think very quickly you get kind of people having a bit of a moment where they're like, oh yeah, actually that does affect you, doesn't it? And we probably need to help you with. So I would say, there's a few things there that will definitely help.
Okay, you've obviously got a large team now, and you've had teams in the past within architecture. What do you think makes a great architect in today's world? And you've touched on a few things in the previous answer, but what do you think makes a good architect?
People skills. I was very lucky in my very early sort of work experience when I was at college and university, I worked for John Lewis. So I very much was put in front of customers and I had to talk to them. I had no choice. And that was, I can't thank that experience enough for giving me the confidence and the the skills just to have a conversation with people, about anything. And that's really given me the communication strengths to now go to C-levels or, challenging people in various businesses to say, right, we need to sort this out. So I think people skills is a massive one. And, there are some people, that may struggle with people skills, but there's various things you can do, to help with that, even if it's just reading. My reading's never been, super strong, but I think reading more and more, it does help. And it also helps with your grammar and your sort of articulation when you're trying to articulate something. So that certainly helps. I think also having, I kind of sometimes use the analogy of like a mariner, so like a ship navigator. So an architect's got to be able to sort of, navigate through various waters, and you're not necessarily going to be able to see what's coming. And I'm more talking about, my reference to that's more specifically about sort of global markets at the moment. So the past 12 months, they've been, I would say, particularly turmoil. And I know it was, turmoil a few years ago when, for example, Broadcom made the various, license changes that affected a lot of businesses. So I think in those sort of situations, you need to be able to sort of read what the market's doing and how that's going to affect your business, especially if you're global. And, say, for example, you do a lot of business with the US market, that's fairly, some people would argue that's quite a, unstable market at the moment. So I think an architect's got to have a finger on the pulse with that. And I think, kind of tied to people skills is being able to sort of communicate with non-technical people and using analogies. So everybody loves a good analogy, and also being able to sort of be holistic. So the analogy that I always refer to and is, I can't remember when I first heard this, but picture yourself walking through a forest and you come across a tree, and you look at that tree, you admire sort of the color of it, what shape it is, the texture, and its immediate surroundings, but you don't get a feel for the whole forest. So, you then go and climb a hill and look down at the entire forest, and you see a completely different picture. You see that one tree in amongst, hundreds, if not thousands of trees, and you see, the actual landscape, you see the undergrowth, you get a full picture. So I think an architect's ability to be able to do that in an IT landscape or an enterprise landscape is extremely important.
Okay. And part of the topic of conversation today is around pragmatic architecture, and that does generally tend to lean into that. Where did your thinking around pragmatic architecture begin? And I suppose, what problem were you trying to solve?
So a lot of people who know me will know that I tell it like it is. I've been in a lot of situations in business where, you'll sit in a room and people will skirt around the subject. They'll, talk about something for 15 minutes when there's, only one point that they're trying to get across. They build a lot of fluff around it. And I've observed that a lot of people don't find any value in that at all. They actually want people just to get to the point. So I've sort of, I'm very much you ask me a question, you'll get an answer. And, I think the C-level execs and the senior leaders I've worked with throughout my career have really appreciated that. And I don't know, maybe that's got me to where I am today, but I feel like there's a lot of appreciation for, not just going straight to the hip and just telling it like it is, and just making sure that even in documentation, when you're doing architecture documentation, is anybody, you kind of need to ask yourself, and I appreciate some organizations have to do it, I get it, but are they really going to read a 50-page high-level design, or are they going to want to know, give us a one-pager, what are the key points, what's the impact, what do I need to do as a a CFO, a CTO, whatever, so I feel like there's a lot of value in that.
If you want to delve down deeper into any particular areas, then
exactly.
you either have a conversation or you can fine.
And we're all busy people, and execs especially nowadays are probably busier than they've ever been before, with various challenges and stuff, and the way the world is, so just get to the point.
And what does it actually look like on a day-to-day basis, in action? We've mentioned their documentation. In what other areas do you use this sort of pragmatic architecture straight to the point? And by the way, just a caveat, you mentioned straight to the point, people get an answer from you. I can imagine there's still some softness around it. It's not super direct to the point, where you're upsetting people. I can imagine, part of the articulation and part of your job is to use vernacular that is fairly soft, but at least they're getting an answer. Is that right?
Yeah,
Or have I
absolutely.
got
Yeah,
that wrong?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. But
You don't want to
depends
be
if I'm at
offending
work or
people,
not. Yeah.
essentially, do you? Yeah, fine, okay.
But yeah, absolutely. You still got to be professional with it. Yeah, absolutely. And you've still got to, respect other people's perspectives and also respect, a lot of the time when you're speaking to people, they've got their own job to do. They've got their own focus areas. They might have their own stresses, the age old sort of mental health saying about, everybody has their own problems. You just don't know them.
Yeah.
So you've got to be respectful in that manner. I think day to day, I think it's not wasting anybody's time. So if you need to talk to somebody about an architecture, challenge, design, idea, just get it out there, And I think, just make sure that you've done your research, I think, as well. And it doesn't have to be extensive, but just make sure that you come a bit prepared. Make sure you've considered the options and what those options mean. I think also it's making sure you prioritize needs and outcomes of a business. So if a business has a need to, I don't know, increase security, it's like, yeah, but what does that actually mean? And also making sure, right, what can we deliver quickly to make sure that outcome's met, or it's that there are demonstrations that we're moving towards meeting it, and just making sure that you concentrate on that. And I think especially when you're dealing with C-levels, a picture paints 1,000 words. Don't try and do loads of documentation or a 10, 20, 30 slide PowerPoint when you can do a couple of diagrams that show where you are now, what the transition is, where you're going to get to, what the impact is. And you can, I feel like there's a lot of value in the architect themselves when they're actually talking that through as well, because it puts a lot of value in you. If actually you could literally talk around a diagram and say, right, this is what this means. And obviously people can then use that onward, for high level conversations with the board, or, if they need to. So I think there's a lot of value in that.
Just want to go back a couple of steps. You mentioned figuring out what the business needs and sort of versus wants and whatnot. How do you navigate the trade-off between doing things the right way and doing what the business actually needs right now? So security is probably a prime example of that, where sometimes your immediate response might not necessarily be the right one long term, but you need to protect yourself straight away because it's urgent. How do you balance that trade-off?
It can be very difficult. And I probably liken architects in this scenario to racing drivers. Racing drivers are always hunting for that perfect lap, that perfect lap time. Architects are always hunting for that perfect solution, but I've yet to find it. So, there's always going to be a trade-off or a compromise. The solution is either going to be too expensive, or it's going to be, too niche to support, or it's going to be fraught with complexity. So there's always going to be a trade-off, and there's always going to be something you've got to kind of compromise on. I think in most situations, I go back to being pragmatic and just being upfront with it. I think in most situations it's important to just be completely transparent with everybody involved, especially the sort of responsible C-level or the sponsor of the project that you're doing or the solution that you're proposing, is making sure they understand the risk, what the impact is, and security, especially as you've mentioned. I mean, there was a few retailers that we all probably know that got attacked quite massively, and it was it had quite widespread media coverage, and even some of the ways that they were dealing with it and reacting to it were, some people would say, quite poor. I heard stories of people being told to bring in their own laptops and stuff to work off the environment, which is a pretty extreme. But that's the sort of stuff you need to communicate when you're putting solutions in. If this doesn't work, the absolute worst case impact is that, you know, we could end up in this situation, you know. And I think they've only recently, you know, one of the retailers that I'm referencing, have only recently just started online orders again. So
Yeah.
I dread to think what the, you know, financial impact of that is.
That was, yeah.
But ultimately, that financial impact then bleeds into, well, okay, how does that affect the share price and people's jobs, and you know, and
everything.
that's
Yeah.
the sort of thing you've got
That's
to
the
you've got to bear
severity
in
of it,
mind.
isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
exactly.
And I suppose that's where architecture is so important, because it's the first step to, as you said right at the beginning, is you've got to have that crystal ball. You've got to be looking forward, worst case scenario or different case scenarios, and almost predicting that, which is kind of like an impossible job in some respects. But you've got to outlay all the scenarios that could happen, and yeah, then you balance it between, right, what's urgent, and can we just sort of tick that, get that out of the way, protect ourselves, and you know, over the next 6 months we'll do it the right way, and kind of, and so on and so forth. So now you started at the very bottom on a service desk, right? And now, you know, you're what, -1 from the C-suite as a chief architect. From a career perspective, what were the pivotal moments, if you look back and you think, right, I did that there, and that gave me this opportunity to go into this role or whatever, work for that person? Or what were the pivotal moments, I suppose, so anybody that is listening that's maybe on that route to chief architect can start looking out for?
Yeah, I'm very lucky to have had a few of them. Again, I talk about my time at John Lewis, having that, building up those soft skills was
Yeah.
very important, and that gave me the confidence to speak to people, you know, when I was on service desks, and not just you know, not just be on the phone trying to fix the issue, but ask how their day was. And you know, I think people would be surprised at how much difference that makes, not just for the person you're helping, but also for your own career and your own
Yeah.
performance. I suppose the next pivotal moment was probably my time at AIT when I was a project engineer. So
Yeah.
I was, you know, we were a fairly small MSP back then, and it was, you know, 1 week I'd be given a server in 365 and a business of, you know, anything between sort of 5 and 50 users to migrate, and I'd have a week to do it. And obviously, being a fairly small MSP back then, you know,
Yeah.
money was important, so there was pressure on getting it done. But because I was a project engineer for that, I was sort of the architect, the project, you know, the delivery resource, and the sort of hypercare support with that. So again, that gave me a lot of kind of breadth to kind of think about, right, okay, well, I've got to, you know, do this migration. How am I going to do it? And also think about the impact back then as a project engineer. You know, when am I going to cut users over? When can I migrate email services that's least disruptive to the business? So that, I suppose, that really started getting me to think about what I was doing and how that was affecting the client's business and their, you know, and there was a few projects where I chose myself to work out of hours because I knew it was better for the business. So that probably helped as well. So I think that really started to develop that architectural mindset.
Okay.
I mean, I suppose the next pivotal moment was my time at Experian. I think having exposure to the amount of scalability they have, not even in terms of technology, but even in terms of the people and the processes, you know, and you know, I'd be on various sort of architecture review board type calls where there'd be, you know, quite a you know, decent sized audience, but they would be the people that you would have on the call. You know, they'd be senior people from compliance and from their sort of their SOC, and also from, you know, their own sort of enterprise architecture teams and stuff. So, and just, you know, kind of observing what questions they were asking, observing what was important to each of them, and just sort of kind of, you know, if I was in their position, what else would I ask, you know, and what would be important to me? So yeah, there's quite a few of those pivotal moments, and you know, I think they've all equally contributed quite significantly to me being, you know, thankfully where I am today.
And as a relatively new chief architect, what have been the biggest sort of surprises or challenges that you didn't expect stepping into the role?
People people can be
Always,
very people can be
always,
very difficult to manage, to communicate with. You know, you could do everything right, and sometimes they still don't get it. And that's just, you've just got to keep working at it, keep trying to, communicate in different ways, showing them different perspectives, or showing them, the same perspective but in a slightly different light, giving them real world examples. I think the other thing I've found, very challenging, and this isn't specific to me being a chief architect, but me being an architect in general, is, I started from sort of a few years ago wanting to sort of upskill my architecture skill set, in terms of going to various bodies and doing, various certifications and stuff like that. And I found a few of them to be quite closed door and very, very clicky, which I found quite upsetting is probably not the word I'd use, just disappointing, really. I mean, there's one body organization where you have to work for one of the Fortune, I think it's 100 or 500 companies to even get a look in.
Right.
And it's like, whilst I get that, it's like there are, they're not the only companies with chief architects or architects, and it's like that nearly every company in the world has, I'd like to think some form of, architecture practice or team of architects. So I found that quite, a little bit daunting in a way, because I've obviously wanted to share my experiences with people, and likewise get experiences of other people with a lot more years in the industry than, well, as an architect as I have. So I found that a little bit very challenging. I think the other point is sort of cultural resistance as well. So I think when you try and advocate for architecture in companies who have not really had it before, it can be quite difficult to convey its value and convey actually, and I know you've spoken about it quite a lot, about the ivory tower architect. And about trying to say, we're not in the ivory tower, we're actually on the front line with you guys and girls, trying to, fight the good fight and make the company and its technology better, a better place. So, but then a nice surprise has actually been the strategic impact that I can have on things. So I think being able to see something through and see, there's been quite a few projects I've worked on, especially in the last few years, where I've seen them come to fruition and actually make quite a significant impact. And I've actually had people come to me and say, oh, I know you worked on X or Y, and, this has really helped me and what I do. And, I think to have that feedback loop has been really good. So I think for any architects out there, I think, make sure you get that feedback loop, because you will get nice messages as well as, ultimately sort of room for improvement.
You touched on some environments where there was like let's call it an immature architecture capability or practice. How did you go about establishing the structure and credibility? Firstly, which one came first, and secondly, what were the sort of practical steps to doing that?
Which one came first between structure and credibility? That is a very good question. I think credibility, because you probably need credibility to help build the structure.
Get buy-in,
and to get buy-in. I think if you start in a company and they've got very little architecture maturity or no architecture practices, I think, trying to establish that organization's priorities is very important, and off the back of that, making sure that you can contribute to those priorities with actual outcomes and value, because immediately the business will then sort of say, oh, actually, an architect over here has suggested this, and we can do this and do that to make things quicker or make things cheaper or more secure or whatever it is. Actually, we should probably see what else he or she has to say, so I think that's really important. And I think when you're establishing the structure, being very careful with how you do it. I mean, it depends on the organization and what their people and culture is like, because some you can no doubt just run away with it and be all good. But I think with most organizations, you've got to be quite careful not to slow things down, and be able to, even if you have to build that structure over a longer term, do the quick wins, get the incremental wins and incremental progress. But it can be difficult. But I think credibility has definitely got to come first.
Fine. Okay. And stepping into sort of architecture from an engineering or any other discipline, I suppose, what advice would you give someone making that transition?
I read, first of all,
Yeah.
read a
Yeah.
lot. It sounds quite, a bit of a boring answer, but read a lot of books. There are, I know I mentioned previously about there are some bodies and organisations that are, a little bit more unwilling to share information and experience and learnings, but I feel like there are quite a few architects and sort of speakers in the industry who have their own blogs and have their own, sort of forums for conveying what they talk about. I know obviously you do a great job with this podcast in terms of
Yep.
getting different sort of people on. So this is a real sort of help as well. Just making sure you get different perspectives from different architects, and a lot of them will talk about projects they've undertaken and what challenges they've had, and actually go into the specifics of how they tackled them. And I think a lot of the time they're always relatable to whatever you're doing.
Okay.
So I always take learnings from sort of other architects and try and sort of apply that where I can in what I'm doing. So yeah, I think and from an engineering mindset, I think architects that come from an engineering mindset are probably the ones who are best set up for it.
Right. Okay.
In my opinion. So, and the reason for that is I think if you've done the do,
Yeah.
well, if you've, someone who's, been doing the do, I feel like you've just got a little bit more exposure to what the impact is going to be, how businesses are actually going to operate whilst you're doing, whilst the solution you've suggested is, happening or whatever. And yeah, I think just being able to think in that way actually puts you in front of other people. And that's not to say that you can't come from an engineer mindset, by the way. I don't want to, sort of iron people out, but I feel like it gives you a lot of benefit. And I think for people who aren't an engineer and want to become an architect, I think if you want to become an architect, just again follow people who are engineers and talked about projects that they've delivered. Whether they've developed an application or delivered a cloud platform solution or whatever, read about what they've done, how they've done it, what they thought about when they were doing it, to kind of give you that perspective, because that will definitely help you, especially when you're having conversations with C-level. It will help you with translation. I always sort of sometimes sort of compare architects to, sort of language translators, because you've got to most of the time translate something technical you're doing, on the left to something that's non-technical on the right, and making sure that people understand, making sure you get your point across and understand what actually you're trying to articulate.
Okay. And with that as well, there'll be elements of imposter syndrome, especially if it's your first architect gig. How have you gone about building confidence, number one for yourself, but also for your team, in a space where, it is, let's call it as it is, filled with seasoned voices, isn't it? Architecture as a discipline. If we look at, some statistics from the report that I produce twice a year around the years of experience people have within an architecture discipline, and that 21 plus years it dominates the previous 4 or 5 sort of brackets. So we're in a space where it's filled with people who think they know best, talk a lot, and there's a young architect, or a new architect, sorry, you're probably coming into it and seeing it on LinkedIn, people saying this and people saying that. How do you, and then from that, you probably think, God, I shouldn't be an architect. This sounds quite complicated. So imposter syndrome steps in. How do you go about building confidence in that space for yourself and for the team?
I've found it very difficult over the years. Sort of I go through phases where I suffer from it quite badly.
Yeah.
In terms of just, have I done that right? I'm quite self-critical of myself. So even if I've, said something to someone on a call when I've been presenting solutions, like, have I said that in the right way? Have I articulated that right? Do they actually understand it? So, and I think doing that a little bit is important, because you've got to look at how you've done things and how you could have improved. But yeah, imposter syndrome is definitely something I've had over the years in various guises. I think it is difficult as well, being a fairly young architect, not necessarily from an age perspective, but from a, I've only technically been in architecture for, sort of 5 years or so, which,
Yeah.
when you read, and listen to people who have been in architecture, who've been in it, some of them talk about doing enterprise architecture in the early noughties,
Yeah.
and you think, wow, I was in school then, so that again can be quite overwhelming and a bit like, should I actually be here? But I think if you can demonstrate, what you do and what value you bring, especially
Yeah.
to stakeholders you work with closely, and especially those that are C-level, senior level, board level, whatever, I think you can very quickly, and go back to credibility, you can very quickly build up that credibility and build
Yeah.
up that you can become your own seasoned voice in a way, and sort of say, well, I've actually done that before, not, it might necessarily be exactly the same, but this is how I tackled it before and it went really well. So actually I'm going to do a similar approach,
Yeah.
or actually, I did it slightly differently. I could do it slightly differently this time and see what the output is, because, X or Y is different. So, and I think also just making sure that, it's funny because when you provide oversight or you
Yeah.
make a decision or you suggest a solution or you do a document, it could be loads of different things, or even talk about it. Doing this podcast will give me a boost of confidence, no
Yeah.
doubt. You get back boost of confidence, and you get the sort of validation of, yeah, you know what, I'm a good architect and I should be here, and actually what I've got to say is interesting. So, but yeah, I think it just comes with experience, I think, doesn't it, as well? I think, as time goes on, I get, older and, maybe a little bit wiser. It'll probably come a bit more naturally. But yeah, and I've read blogs of more seasoned architects who still suffer imposter syndrome
Yeah.
today, and they've been in the industry for decades. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's anything that kind of ever goes away.
Yeah.
I suppose it
Okay.
depends who you are as a person, doesn't it? But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to move on to our quick fire questions, and
Yeah.
you'll probably see a lot of this, but the answer we already know. Like the question is, what do you expect will be a game changer from a tech perspective in 2025? Right? Everybody that I've interviewed in this series has said AI, and the previous series actually. But I suppose from your perspective, how are businesses using AI to actually transform their business?
Yeah, I would be wrong not to say AI, wouldn't I? I do have another answer for you, which we'll come on to in a
Go.
minute, which is quite interesting. But how are businesses transforming using AI? I mean, it's a problem that, it's a very interesting question. And I think that's what a lot of organizations are asking themselves. There's a lot of people who have gone and bought a Copilot. They've gone and subscribed to ChatGPT. And, it's great for taking meeting notes and great
Yeah.
for doing a bit of coding here and there, and great for, automating, a small task you might do, but
Yeah.
actually where's the full value of, that, however much it costs ChatGPT license that you pay for every month, where's the actual value coming from? And actually, it's quite funny because I think a lot of businesses now, and I've read a lot about businesses presenting their sort of AI initiatives, which basically just says, oh yeah, we're going to use more AI. But it's like now people are at board level and shareholders are saying, yeah, but how are you going to actually use it?
Yeah.
And I know WhatsApp, for example, they've just put AI on their platform, and it's like, they've probably done that just to tick a box. Like,
Yeah.
I know you can use AI to write some messages, but like, who needs AI to write a text?
Yeah.
There might be some people, if you can't spell or you have dyslexia, then yeah, fine. But I don't know. I feel like they've just done it just to do it and just say they've done it. But yeah, I think, I'm expecting the game-changing bit to be, actually what's the nuts and bolts and the really decent sort of outcomes that AI can produce,
Okay.
and I think with, when DeepSeek came out, I think it was start of the year, wasn't it, when it had like reasoning, I think that was very interesting, and that
Yeah.
was obviously sort of forced the hand of ChatGPT, OpenAI and ChatGPT to accelerate some of their reasoning models and stuff. So I think, when you start to look at the maturity of it, I think that's probably going to be a game changer. The other answer I was going to give as well is actually, and there was a company who documented this quite widely in the media, is people moving away from public cloud. And I probably see this a little bit more because I work for an
Yeah.
MSP with their own private cloud and their own data centers. But
Yeah.
a lot of people are moving to public cloud and then going, oh, wow, actually, it's quite expensive, isn't it? And they're moving back.
Yeah.
So that although it's not a game changer, I think that's a trend we're actually going to see grow more than people think. And a lot of people are, are sort of talking about themselves moving back and how expensive the public cloud, has turned out for them. Which you could turn around and say, well, actually, did you do a proper, architecture design at the start, and did you actually look at the cost implications and what you were going to put into it and all the rest of it, which is I'm sure, a whole nother topic. But yeah, that would be my second answer, I think.
We've had a couple of people on one from a consultancy and one from an end user, so to speak, so an industry business, and they both said exactly the same thing. They were one of the early adopters of moving everything to AWS. One was AWS, one was Azure. And they mentioned sort of 5 years in, actually, the cost is probably more than an on-prem solution. There's other benefits to cloud and stuff, but they've actually now gone hybrid, not hybrid public cloud, hybrid on-prem versus cloud, which can work as well. So any advice you wish you'd received earlier on in your career?
Get stuck in.
Yeah.
Get stuck in. It sounds cliche, but yeah, get stuck in, get doing stuff. And I suppose speak to everybody. I don't think the newer generation of IT grads and stuff coming through have, from what I've seen, they don't speak to everybody. They don't, they're not over communicative, even if it's just, what are you working on? What's new in your world?
Yeah.
Those two questions alone, when you stood at the coffee machine or the water, the water station, can give you so much insight and so much, like, you walk away most of the time going, oh, right, okay, that's actually quite interesting. I need to keep up with how that's going, or, check back in with them and see how that turned out, because you'll learn so much in those conversations. Whereas I've seen many people just, blindly stare into the abyss. But yeah, I think speak to everybody, no matter what level they are. They've all got their own perspectives and they're all working on something that's important to them and their role. So yeah, just make sure you speak to everybody.
And it's something I advise when I'm sort of helping people with their careers. I speak to a lot of people who want remote work, and, I'm always advising, look, you're an architect. Part of your role is building relationships.
You've got to be
and it's easier to build relationships face to face. That's just a fact. Yeah, people can do it over Teams. Of course they can. But what you miss is probably about 70% of the actual truth, which is when you're next to a coffee machine having a coffee and you're bored, you make conversation. That small chat is what builds the trust, the relationships, and you find out what people are doing, what challenges they've got. Well, actually, give me 24 hours, I'll come back with a solution for that, or whatever it may be. And all of a sudden, your career just catapults because you're speaking to people. They recognize what you do, and going right back to that beginning thing that we spoke about, what makes a good architect. You're communicating what you're doing, and you're building credibility of your profession. So then when you want to go and get something, people know what you do, how you do it, and that actually you're pretty good. Really hard to do that when you sat at home working from home all the time. But
yeah, and you've touched on you've touched on another good point there about you actually, if you're in the office and you're at the coffee machine or whatever, you're presenting the face of architecture. So when that person that you've just had that 5-minute interaction with goes, oh, I need this, I need to put a new system in, or I need to think about a solution. It's like, oh yeah, well, I met an architect at the coffee. Let me reach out to them and see what they think. So it helps in that regard as well.
100%. From a talent perspective, what do you expect to change in the next sort of 5 years?
I think what I'm starting to see it a little bit now, to be honest. So, and it kind of touches on what we spoke about with AI and what we've just spoke about in regards to being sort of communicative is, there's a lot of companies. I think it was it Meta who were basically replacing junior devs with AI, or have said they're going to do that. I suppose my sort of change and concern with that is, what's that going to mean for people who move up the ranks and want to move up the ranks but haven't necessarily got that experience at the lower levels, which I think is actually really important. I think it's super important for you to spend, a year or two on the service desk as a junior, or, doing low level junior sort of, dev coding work, I think it's super important because
Mhm.
because you're in the weeds, you get to see what's important to, Margaret in accounts,
Yeah,
what's important.
absolutely.
You get to see that, and you wouldn't see that any other place really. So yeah, I do think the biggest change is going to be, especially in architecture, seeing architects, come up through the ranks who haven't
Yeah,
necessarily got that experience and knowledge that you would have otherwise picked up in junior roles.
junior role. Yeah,
Um,
and all that's going to happen is it will squeeze that senior market more,
yeah,
and there'll
exactly.
be
Yeah,
less of them, and therefore the demands and salaries go up, and then you're back in the same problem, which is you're spending just as much money on headcount as you were, whether you've got AI or you've got an actual person doing the job. But that's my prediction anyway. So we're going to end the episode with a question for our next guest. What is your question for the next guest?
so I've had a bit of exposure to this, but I'm intrigued as to what your next guest's answer will be. My question is, if you had to start a modern architecture practice from scratch,
Yep,
what would be 3 principles or things that would be non-negotiable?
love that.
So I'm
Well,
looking forward to the answer to that.
absolutely. Brilliant. Well, sadly, Ben, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your time and for an excellent podcast episode. It's been really interesting about chatting about your thoughts around pragmatic architecture. So once again, thanks for your time and for an excellent episode.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate it.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Transformational Blueprints. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found plenty of insights and takeaways to fuel your journey. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could share it, leave a review, or give us a like. It helps us reach more people in the industry who can benefit from these conversations. Don't forget to follow Synaxia Group on LinkedIn to stay updated on new episodes. The links are in the show notes. Join us next time for more tips, strategies, and stories from some of the brightest minds in technology and transformation. Until then, take care and keep transforming.